Hello, and welcome to another one of our conversations called The Church in the World. This is where we tackle difficult conversations because we believe that Jesus is the answer, but often we feel that we as the church are not even part of the conversation. So we try to join the conversation. Today we're going to go a little bit of a different direction, and I want to talk about the evolving landscape of missions. And so I invited a couple of our church's international workers to join. We have Nishant, who is working technically most recently in East Africa, but that's after being all over the place, which you can touch on as you want. And then also Dan, who spends his time primarily in the Middle East, but again, not necessarily local to there. I'm the one that kind of stays put. They bounce around. So anyway, gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Looking forward to this evening's conversation. And any opening comments, or do you want to just jump right in?
Great. No, it's great to be here, and it's great to have these conversations. I think it's something that by talking through it puts it on the forefront, and it kind of keeps it on everyone's radars, and I think that's important.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Nishant, but missions kind of has a bit of a family with you guys, right?
Yeah. I think I think working and living internationally, my grandfather worked with the UN. My father worked with large NGOs, and so we moved around quite a bit. Grew up in 6 countries before we immigrated here. And then in the last 10 years, Aaron and I have lived in 5 different countries. So now we're settled in Kenya and working kind of in the region.
That's awesome. And Dan, what about you? What's kind of the background that brings you to a missions type conversation?
I was born and raised in Southeast Asia. I'm Chinese, Malaysian, Portuguese background. Spent 18 years in Malaysia from the time I was born, and then we moved to Canada. Spent 18 years here, and now we have for the last 10 years been in the Middle East, my wife and I and our 2 kids. Same thing with my wife, Dara. She was born and raised in Southeast Asia as well. Moved here when she was 10. Both of us have moved, I think combined the 2 of us, probably close to 70, 80 times. Lived in many different cities. She comes from a family where on her dad's side, there's 11 kids, and 10 of them are either pastors or missionaries. So it's quite a bit of legacy there on her side as well.
Well, I appreciate both of you joining and bringing that kind of background. So, okay, we want to talk about missions. Might not be even the best word anymore, but let's go with it. So one of you or both of you kind of give a generally accepted working definition of missions. When a normal North American churchgoer hears that word, what comes to their mind? Dan, start us off.
I think I'm going to go with the traditional sense of it. It's the idea that we, as a community of people, commission somebody who feels like they have been called of God to take the gospel of salvation into faraway lands, so you could say maybe Africa or maybe Asia or places like Latin America. Traditionally for the last 100, 150 years, that's how it's been understood. And it's quite a bit removed from what we do here. And then we say, well, missions, okay, something that we do over there, which is probably half true, or probably less than half true when you think about it, because it should be an all-encompassing thing, right? Missions is bringing the kingdom of God into the sphere of where we are right now. So,
Nishant, any edits or additions or subtractions?
No, and I think in add, we're kind of from the North American, quote unquote, Western perspective. I think the connotation is it's primarily like a verbal proclamation. That's usually what's associated is like the gospel is like proselytizing. And it's just that is probably the one that predominantly comes at the forefront of when you say missions. That comes first, is kind of clicks. At least it did for me for many years.
Okay, let's double click here. With that as our working definition that is generally accepted in the church, what are the strengths and the pros to that definition? And then also after that, where is it lacking? Dan, you kind of already started to touch on it a little bit, where we separate, but what's good about it? And then let's go ahead and talk about where maybe it has some gaps.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything good about that definition.
Oh, okay, all right, carry on.
It's left us, it's left quite a big gap in how we've done the work, it's sort of like a half, maybe even a quarter definition of what it should have been. If you think of what Jesus did, he's the quintessential missionary, right? I mean, incarnational, when he came, he preached the gospel, he fed the poor, the hungry, he clothed the poor, he healed the sick, he cast out demons, and he lived among the people. And so we got some of that there where we say, okay, we go and live among the people, but a lot of times what we have just done is just proclaim the gospel. As Nishan talked about, it's a gospel of proclamation. But it wasn't a gospel of the kingdom. There were so many things, other things associated with that we as missionaries haven't been taught how to do. When Jesus healed the sick, for example, we weren't trained in seminary, or we weren't trained in our missions organizations to say, okay, how do we go about praying for people, expecting God to heal the sick? Or
and you're arguing that we should be trained on that.
I think so.
Okay, carry on.
Or demonization, for example. I mean, Nishan's probably seen it, and I've seen it. I've seen demons in people, and I've seen demons in kids. And in my first 2 years, while I was there, I remember telling my wife, Dara, when I was in a room and this kid was starting manifesting, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my head stand, and I'm thinking, there's a demon in this room, it's manifesting. I'm writing to my wife and telling her, we need to leave this house now. Now, that's not what missionaries should be doing, but I'm not prepared for this. I haven't been trained for this. I don't know how to do this. And so a lot of times we're sending people out unprepared, not equipped, not ready to deal with some of it's a lot of demonic activity on the field in one sense, apart from all the other kinds of human brokenness that comes with the fall, like hunger and violence and corrupt governments, all those other things.
Wow, there's so many things to chase there, but we'll come back to it. Nishan, where are the pros, where are the cons to our working definition of the proclamation somewhere else?
Yeah, kind of like Dan was saying, that is a limited and not a very good definition. And I think, you use the word whole. There was a book that was written several years ago by the then CEO of World Vision US called The Hole in Our Gospel. And it talked about how our definition of the gospel is so limited. There's so much more missing to it. And he goes and talks about, what a lot of these large faith-based NGOs, what is the motivation to do humanitarian and development work and meet physical needs? Because that's all part of kingdom building. And I think I think it's good. There are pros and cons to using a term like missions, because one, it helps us to understand that this is going above and beyond just accepting and believing and having a faith that is internal. But I think the limitation then is we think of mission as being something that is beyond or more. Whereas I would say that the things that are oftentimes encompassed in being missional, what we understand as missional, could also be very well understood as just being a Christian. You're living out your faith in all aspects of your life. It is just completely, it's not just like I believe something and so that's between me and God. If you actually believe that, it completely transforms your life. And so that's living out your faith. And that, I think, is the aspect of where saying I would say it's just being a Christian, yeah.
Okay, so let me jump in here because I feel like we might be starting to diverge a little bit. You're talking about really this is just being a normal Christian, a whole Christian.
It should be.
Okay. And then, Dan, you were saying we're not specializing in training our sendees sufficiently. I almost feel like those are distinct and I feel like it's probably congruent. How do we train them to be normal? Or, you know what I mean? Like, is it specialized or is it actually every Christian should be doing spiritual warfare and healing, praying for healing and these things? Like, walk me through this because, yeah, I don't know.
Yes.
Great answer. Feel free to unpack.
So I think you headed me off there, and that's a great point, by the way, what Nishan is saying. I don't really think there should be any lines of demarcation between those who go overseas and those who stay.
Okay, so, sorry, I'm interrupting. and I'm going to keep interrupting apparently, but so what we're actually making an argument for without actually articulating it yet is that overall many Christians are living well below what's available to them in their identity in Christ, how they should be living.
I think so.
Okay, this makes more sense. Carry on.
And Nishan touched on this. I think mission should be an outflow of a disciple life. It should be an outflow of following Jesus, right? When Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he wasn't talking about some kind of esoteric / internal heart and mind kind of thing only. How I lived, how I have loved, how I have laid my life down, how I have died. Like that's the kind of way that I'm showing you how to. That's why he lived with his disciples for 3 years and then said, go into all the world, teaching them everything I have shown you and baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and teaching them. It's more than just about knowledge. It's about this way that he lived. And so if you talk about, yes, I don't think we are sending our workers that go overseas, I don't think we're sending them well-equipped enough. I don't think we're well-equipped. I don't think we're equipping our congregations well enough to be kingdom builders in their communities, wherever they are at. I think mission should not be geographically determined. It's just some are called overseas, some are called here, but everybody's called, right?
Okay, that actually clears up a lot. Carry on.
And I think also everyone has unique skill sets, right? So not everyone is called to do something that what Dan is doing is a very different skill set than what I have, than what you have, than what our cameraman has, what the people in the room, in the audience are watching have, right? And so I think the pressure shouldn't be like, oh, because this is how someone else is doing something that may be more visible is what I am called to do. And that's the definition or the poster child example of what mission is because they're doing that. And I think that can be a bit confusing because then I think this is where we find our place because we all have unique gifts, we all have unique circumstances and abilities and relationships. And those can be used very uniquely. We need to find how that fits into God's overall mission of what he is doing and finding our place in what God is already doing. And I think that is where we need to see how God has uniquely equipped us and where does that fit in, instead of saying like, oh, so-and-so did that, so maybe that's what I need to do, and I need to get those skills. But we still need to also further refine, just because one has, is artistic, they still might need to learn technical skill sets to make sure that those skills are at the top notch so that they can be effective at those skills, for example.
Okay, so side question, with as much specificity or generality as you want to answer, what are some of the skill sets you each bring and how or where are you using them? You started by saying, Dan has a skill set, you have one, it's different than mine, it's different than the camera guy. What skill sets are you guys currently, brag if you want, or do the humble brag, but you got invited here for a reason, so let's talk about it. What are you doing?
I think for me, one thing that I realized very quickly is that I am not very gifted when it comes to necessarily the verbal aspect of it. But I can, if people ask me about why do I believe it, I can tell them. I cannot give a theological argument or whatever it may be. That's not my area of skill sets. I was always very drawn and intrigued by engineering and design and architecture and that side of things. And so that's where I felt a strong calling and affirmation to go into there. And I always kind of wondered, well, where does this fit? And is it something that maybe I just do it and I do it well and that's completely separate from my Sunday mornings, let's say, going to church. And that's kind of something that I wrestle with. And then I realized that one can actually honor God in what you do and the things that you make. And you can be responsible with that. And I think one thing that I quickly realized was that this is all in a system, right? And I saw if I'm, for example, designing a product, it's often easy to blame people, oh, they didn't recycle the product at the end of the life. But if you design a product that's not easy to disassemble and to do that, right? I'm very much have a responsibility in that and being a steward of the resources that God has given us and taking care of the planet. And so that was my that was one of the early ways that I started to see that different skill sets that may not be necessarily seen traditionally on a Sunday morning in church can be used to glorify God, can be used to build a kingdom. There's a movie that I like, which is based on real life, but Chariots of Fire, and one of the things, there was an argument that the characters were having, and he was talking, Eric Liddell was, there was a race on a Sunday morning, and he was having a debate with his sister, you shouldn't run on the Sunday because it's the Sabbath and you should rest and stuff. And he just made a really interesting quote, and he said, like, I feel God's glory when I run because God has made me fast. And that's how I glorify God, is by using the skills that God has given me and being the best at it, or the best that I can be with it. And so for me, that was another thing. I played a lot of sports growing up, to say, like, I can try and do this and be a good sportsman and try and glorify God in that. So those are a couple different examples of that.
I think part of what, and I'm liking that we're talking about uniqueness as opposed to some people are more special than others. And that's not the case at all. We're not talking about it at all. And we got to keep in mind the priesthood of all believers, that concept, that all of us are called to play, all of us are called to the sandbox, all of us are called to be in this, you can call it a game or in the work, or whatever you want to call it, but we all have a role to play. For me, I felt for a long time that because of the multicultural nature, one of my makeup, because I'm Malaysian, Chinese, Portuguese, and then the three languages that I was raised speaking, and then I had to pick up another one in the Middle East. That plus my passion for leader development, and then those things coupled with the passion of seeing the places that don't have enough resources that they get their share, or at least being part of equalizing. And I saw so much, the North American church having so much, and part of my passion was I want to equalize some of that. I want to be part of the solution of seeing other parts of the world have their share of leader development, of training, of church planters. And so my life mission is basically to use whatever gifts God has given me. I'm primarily an apostle teacher, if I want to use the APAST model, of using those gifts to develop leaders, next generation leaders, so millennials and under, for the hardest and the darkest parts of the globe. And so places where there are no trainings, where there are no leaders, where people can't go as freely, where we got to use our pseudonyms and can't use our real names. Those are kind of places I have a passion to see leaders raised up for.
No, this is huge, because I think one of the issues that, and this is just me kind of riffing off here for a second, but I think one of the issues we've created, our own monster we've created in the North American church, is there has been a very small and specific set of gifts that have been celebrated and elevated. And then once we get on the stage, then we gift appropriate, where because this is my thing, this needs to be your thing, because this is how I did it, this is how you have to do it. And we start to create cookie cutters instead of celebrating the individuality and that skill set that each person, understanding that everyone who has the Holy Spirit inside them does have the priesthood of the believers, is equipped and being transformed into the image of Christ to use whatever they're good at, running, product design, a leader development, a language acquisition, building, networking, whatever that is, to advance the kingdom, not just the sage on the stage on Sunday morning. So this is not part of where I thought the conversation would go, but I'm very glad it did. So thank you. Let me look at my notes to see if I can, unless when do you want to jump in on something that's been said so far and develop it a little more? All right. Okay, so I've heard both of you speak recently. And what was fascinating was very different styles and very similar messages, and it was not coordinated. And as in, like, you didn't coordinate together. The message themselves were coordinated, in case that didn't come out right. But so one of the things you both implied, I believe it was Henry Blackaby, who said, watch to see where God is working and join him in his work. And so I know that's been a passion, a desire of both of you, both from when I heard you speak and then just in conversations. But let's talk about that. When you look around, it can be specific to your area of the world, or when you kind of step back, take the macro view and look at what God seems to be doing right now, 2021, Where is God at work? What is he doing?
I think part of that line in my message was that God isn't interested in building churches. He's interested in building the kingdom. No, God isn't interested in filling up church buildings. He's far more concerned and passionate about building the kingdom. Not to say that church buildings are wrong and that people coming to church buildings on a Sunday is wrong, but when we've reduced our Christian existence or our walk to a Sunday morning experience, we found that COVID-19 really upended all of that. And many of us were struggling and finding, okay, how do I exercise my faith, or what is God doing if I can't go to church on a Sunday morning? And as the last year and a half has unfolded, as God has done the pruning and taken away a lot of the non-essentials and forced us back into the essentials of prayer, of community, of sitting quietly and dealing appropriately with grief and dealing with some of the things that we gave a lot of space to in our lives and cut God out. And he says, I'm creating now this space for me to come back in. What I'm finding is that people are discovering God's work in places that they never would have thought possible. And so, for example, in the Middle East, we have had people coming to Christ and being baptized because they are now meeting in smaller groups, because now there's space to meet. Those small groups now allow for trainings to be had, for some soul care to happen, for some baptisms to happen. And even though it's illegal for them to be believers, even though they know they're going to be prosecuted or they know they're going to be pursued, but because of what COVID shut down socially for so many of them, the only place they had was each other. And the only place they had was a Zoom meeting or that Bible study on that Zoom meeting to connect, to get deeper into the world when all the other entertainment and all the other community things were taken away from them.
Fascinating. Where else are you seeing it, Nishant?
I think, unfortunately, there's been, there's a lot of suffering happening right now. You're seeing some of the worst humanitarian crises in the world right now. And I think that has given an opportunity for, what do we often say? Like, they will know we are Christians by our love, right? And in the midst of chaos, in the midst of despair and suffering, it has given the opportunity for people to respond. And not to necessarily say anything, but just to love their neighbor, to go and support them, to try and bring peace, to try and meet immediate needs. And I think what's exciting is that has just given, people have begun to feel loved. They've begun to feel that they are not forgotten in the midst of all of this. And that is so powerful. And there are examples of where people have begun to see that in a more immediate form, where that has grown and where that starting point goes to. And there are things where that people may not see where that what will the result of that be for a long, many, many years. But I think this is where I see, God is equipping churches, God is equipping organizations, God is equipping individuals to basically say there is need and we can't just stand aside and do nothing. Let us go out there and meet the need, and I think God can be found in the midst of that brokenness.
Okay, I want to take that in a little bit of a different direction, but before I do you see that maybe being, what's a good word here? Like concentrated in certain geographical regions or areas or certain people groups, or like, wow, it's really happening here right now type thing? Are you seeing it's kind of localized in any way?
Yeah, I think in the last 10 years, a lot has been happening in the Middle East. I'm personally not involved in that, but just from my network, knowing of a lot that is involved, I think, being able to see churches respond to needs, to meet needs of refugees, I think has been amazing, and that has seen, has empowered and took something that has been so distant often, that people have not known about, if they've heard about, they did not have interaction with, and it's enabled people to connect at a much deeper level. And I think that may be something that Dan probably can speak to a bit more. But I think also, Dan talked about his unique heritage. I talked about my unique heritage. I think What has changed probably in the last 100 years, not even probably in the last less than 50 years, is just globalization. And I think, where traditionally, again, going back to the older kind of understanding of what mission was, it was like someone who was born and raised in one context, going to another context and like living their life there, and then, coming back, to retire, or like, living out the rest of their days. I think I joke sometimes that, with my wife, in a bit of a morbid way, right? We're not being sent off with our coffins, whereas back in the old days, they would send someone off and they would go with their coffins because they were never going to come back. It wasn't possible. But now you see kind of immigrants and diaspora communities. You see people who are growing up in multiple countries. They're not just, they're not just third culture kids. They're like global nomads. They've developed more than a third culture, right? They're not just one culture from one country and another, developing a unique culture. I grew up in 6 different countries. Those are all part of me in some sense. And then, my kids, I see that in them growing up in multiple countries. Each place they learn and they grow and they expand a bit more. And so that has also changed, I think, a lot of the dynamics in terms of the power dynamics of what we would say is missions. Whereas before it could have been very one-sided power dynamic. And then I would say there was a bit of a push to say, okay, now let's just fully localize and support what's happening locally and stand back. But I think a lot of these lines have been blurred, where now you're seeing, there's a lot of this interdependence. And I think God can be seen in the midst of these unique relationships and unique cultures and unique experiences and bridging of places together that allows for new and unique things, because now it's not just one voice overpowering another voice. I think now there is this unique kind of, blend of different aspects.
2 quick clarifying questions for me. When you say the power dynamics shifting from what they were, am I interpreting you accurately to say that was the North American church that was the proverbial power in that, and then pushing towards the local? And now, is that what you're talking about when you say that power dynamics have shifted from I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but was that the North American church? Yeah,
the North American, or the quote unquote, as some would call the Western church, right? And of course, it's easy to look back. I think in every point in time, everyone was doing what they thought was best, and kind of, right? And it's easy now, looking at it with this lens, to look back and say, oh, they did this wrong, or they could have done that better. That's very easy to do. And in 50 years' time, I think, people will be judging this conversation, right? How do they not know this, right? But I think part of the growth, I think, is the church has grown, as believers have grown in their understanding of what does it mean to be a Christian, what does it mean to follow Jesus and to live out that faith. I think what the unique aspect now is kind of the multiculturalism, the globalization has allowed for, whereas before it was so segregated, where people would leave and they would never come back, and there would not be an understanding of different contexts and cultures and the richness of that. That barrier has now kind of been broken in many sense, right?
Okay, and I will invite you back into the conversation in a minute, but I'm hung up here. Okay, so after that you said we've moved to an interdependency. When you say that, are you saying that's progress, or is that necessity? Or does it matter?
That's a good question. To a certain extent, it doesn't matter how we got there. I think it's a good movement, and I think it is progress, because I think there are unique perspectives and skills and understanding. Right, someone from a certain context knows that context the best. Right, they know their language, they know their people, they know their geography the best. And so, as much as someone who comes from the outside will try and learn the language, they will always be at a slight disadvantage than those who are born and raised in a certain aspect. But those who come from outside have also a very unique perspective too, that can help strengthen and bring, to strengthen or to amplify things there. And I think that's what the gospel allows us, to take that message and to then bring it together and understand it differently, because it was also written in a context and the experiences of people in a context that none of us have grown up with. It was thousands of years ago.
Okay, I'm processing. Dan, edit, jump in. What do you want?
I think part of part of the trends that Nishant has identified, they go hand in hand when you talk about globalization, when you talk about people, the movements of people, the whole refugee movements of people. Um, we can't forget the rise of the global South church, right? I mean, the fastest growing churches are no longer
Define
sorry, not
global
global South, the majority world church. So outside of Europe and outside of North America, our large, and by the way, the church in North America, the church in Europe, it's not growing, and I'm pretty sure the church in North America is growing, but a lot of that growth is attributed to immigrants bringing their Christian faith with them into Canada, and then and that's sort of like stemming the tide, the net tide of people leaving the church in a lot of our Western contexts, and so the majority world church in some places is growing at an unprecedented rate. When you think about places like China, for example, even if 1 or 2% of the people come to Christ, you're talking about millions and millions, right? And it's not just 1 or 2%. I think they're saying that church in China is about 150, 200 million. And so that's not a small amount. If even 1% of those, or even 0.5% of those decide that, well, I think God wants us to bring the gospel to North Korea and to other parts of Africa, you're talking 1 million missionaries, just like that. And then I was in a meeting in a partnership meeting with some pastor and church leader from Nigeria, and he said, "Yeah, we're looking at sending, we're looking at wanting to send missionaries around the world." And I said, "How many are you thinking about?" I said, "Oh, we're thinking about 10 or 15,000." And I'm saying that those kinds of numbers we can't comprehend. But when you think about these cultures, right, the African cultures and the South Asian cultures or the Asian culture, when you're thinking about collectivistic cultures, they think in terms of massive communities. And when they think of sending people, they don't think of sending 1, 2, or a dozen. They're thinking, yeah, I think we're thinking of mobilizing tens of thousands or 1 million people around the world. We can't comprehend of that kind of movement of workers across. And so I think one of my mentors used to put it best. He said, at this point, God is taking people from the nations and sending them to the nations, regardless of where they come from and regardless of where they're going. And so a lot of boundaries that we have in our heads about geographical boundaries, a lot of the brothers and sisters that I've talked to from around the world, and I've been to a lot of partnership meetings, those kinds of boundaries don't exist for them. And for a lot of them, mission work is a lot cheaper than how we do it. When you think of sending a Western worker across the world, you're talking about salaries, you're talking about schooling, you're talking about healthcare. It's not economically, it's quite heavy on the sending base. When I talk to my brothers and sisters from South America or Africa or Asia, when they send workers across, it typically is about 25 to 40% of what we need overseas. And so just the nature of the conversation that's happening.
Okay, so I want to chase a metaphor here for a second, so play along. Hopefully it makes sense. This is how my brain works sometimes. So, we use the phrase the cutting edge of this technology, the cutting edge of the movement. So using that metaphor, using the idea of missions as a knife cutting through the kingdom of darkness, I know as a Western Christian, professional Christian leader, the tendency is to think that we are still the cutting edge. We're the knife's blade, right? Based on what you're saying, I need to challenge that. Who or where is the cutting edge? Kind of sounds like the North American church might be the handle that's kind of pushing it, whether it's finances or resources or something, maybe at best, but who's the knife's, the edge of the blade? You mentioned China, you mentioned the Southern Church, or the Global South. Any thoughts?
Let me push it back and say, well, what are we defining as mission? Are you talking about the cutting edge of sending people from one place to another, or are we talking about people who are in their own communities being transformative in, outside of the church?
I did not think my analogy that far through. So
let me jump in here.
Yeah.
And I would agree with him. Like last week, I was interviewing 3 female leaders in their country where if they were found that they were leaders of the faith in this Muslim country, they would be killed, jailed, tortured, whatever. And they've been believing for the last 10 to 20 years. And for two of them, it was mother and daughter, and the girl was a teenager. And they have lived with far less resources, with far less luxury, not even 10% of what we are accustomed to in this part of the world. And life would be so much easier for them if they did not convert. And I remember one question I asked the lady, and I said, what does the Bible mean to you? And she looked at it, she put her hand on it, and with tears in her eyes, she said, this is life. And I want us to understand, like when we use words like innovation and cutting edge, for a lot of these communities that we're talking about, the only innovation or cutting edge strategy they have, they move by the Spirit of God. Wherever He speaks, whatever He does, whatever He tells them to do, they just do it. And a lot of times our technology and our strategy and our education creates barriers for us to hear clearly what God is saying. And these guys just have no choice. And when I see the kind of impacts they're having in their community, where churches now, the church in this one country, there's more people in that church than all the other 6 countries that surround it combined. You got to ask yourself the question, like, it begs the question, what is, as he says, what is cutting edge? Like, what is innovation? When you see some of these communities seemingly popping up, and they don't have many resources by the standards of the world, but they do have sort of like an infusion in that time of the Spirit of God for this time and place.
And when you're looking at like super remote or poorer communities, right, it's the local faith leader that is not just the person for spiritual support, right? They're the person for everything, right? You have challenges in agriculture, they go to the faith leader, right? And so that person now needs to be, this is where the role of the church can be in a very remote and difficult place, can be the place where that person is trusted, can be now the person who can then help the community to thrive, to overcome physical, earthly challenges. And I think that's where yeah, I think those are areas of you can see innovation, because it's the gospel being put to life. It's good news to the poor now. They can see it tangibly. They can see, yeah, okay, I understand what this means in terms of spiritually, but I can also see that this is the kingdom in all aspects.
You're laughing. Do you want to add something?
I'm fine.
Okay, so then let me ask you this question. I'm scared I'm not going to like the answer, but I'm going to ask anyway. What you just described, where the local church in these remote areas can be the gift of life in so many areas, is that possible in the North American church? And what would it take for my civil leaders to go, we have in this postal code, we have this problem. Church, fix it. What is between where we are and is that even possible, and what would it take to get there?
It's possible, I think. And I think, again, it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier, right? How do we understand what mission is, right? And I think this is where it's not just a Sunday morning type thing. It permeates all aspects of life, right? And I think that's where we need to see the church is going beyond just what we would typically see on a Sunday morning. If those are important things, but that goes well beyond the potential impact that community can have, right? You talked about earlier, it's not just about filling up a building, on a Sunday morning, right? The message is life, and it can be life towards the community. So that means then we need to bring in other expertise that historically or traditionally, depending on the connotations of the definition of mission, we need to bring in those skill sets that we don't normally associate with that, right? It's not just about who can teach really well. It's not just about someone who can sing really well, or or is able to mentor really well. It goes well beyond that. And I think once we understand that, and once we can nurture that, once we can find a place to be strategic in that and say, like, here is a challenge in a community, and we can bring a voice to this because there was no voice in this challenge. Maybe it's a justice issue. So maybe you need someone with a legal background who understands how do you advocate for a need that is neglected beyond just raising awareness on a Sunday morning, right? How do you move that through there? So that, I think, is definitely possible, and I think this is where those unique giftings that everyone has, we need to be intentional, one, to help people understand where does that fit into bringing about the kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven.
And I'm going to jump quickly on the whole excellence in whatever we're called to do, not just what's needed on a Sunday morning. I don't know if you guys know, I mean, you probably know Wilberforce and, abolitionist. And at one point, Wilberforce, he was so sick and he was so stressed and partially depressed that he wanted to quit being a politician and just he wanted to be a pastor. He wanted to go pastor a church. And you're laughing. For him, that was the way out, and he was cautioned against it. And his mentors or his leaders said, no, don't you do this. God has given you a sacred duty of pushing this through. And if not for him, imagine the millions or thousands of lives that would not have been freed or saved or changed because he didn't want to do the hard thing. And now back to what you're saying, what would it take for us to go from here to there? I think in our context, we have an aversion to any kind of suffering or any kind of laying our life. We just don't want to do it. And that's why partially COVID has been so hard for our community here and for our communities in North America. I think because we've lost control and we've lost comfort and we've lost our rights and we've lost freedom of movement. Where I'm from, or where I was before I got back here, the government just said, you can't do this. And we said, okay, I guess we can't do it. And life goes on. And if I talk to my communities in Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East, they were still doing what they were called to do. They say, okay, yeah, we got a little more restrictions, but doesn't stop us from meeting, doesn't stop us from being the people of God, doesn't stop, we'll test, we'll wear masks, but we'll still do discipleship. We'll still feed the poor. We'll still visit the refugees when they come in. We'll still try and figure out, who are the new people in our community that don't know or haven't heard of who this person named Jesus is in their own mother tongue. So, just wanted to.
Yeah, no, that's good. And sorry, don't mind me over here. I'm hung up because, if I'm understanding what's being said, and we reinterpret or redefine missions as not a thing that somebody goes and does over there, and it's primarily a speaking thing and a theological thing, but it's actually something we become and do where we are, and then you add to this the elevation of all skill sets, all welcoming everybody to the table, man, if we pull that off, that's a completely different model.
But I don't want to forget, and I know we talked about being the church where we're at and mission living out as a disciple, followers of Jesus, but Jesus was very clear, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. And so we still need to be attentive to
Absolutely.
that there is a global dimension to the gospel of the kingdom, and there are dark places and hard places where that is not yet a reality. And we as a people of God get to bring that reality for people. We can't forget that. And a lot of us are living in cultures and contexts where we have a lot of resources, and the only way those people will get an exposure, either through the word or through deed or through a program, is if some people feel the compulsion and the calling and they respond to, I think I need to do this. So as much as I'm we got to build it wherever we are at, I'm also very much of, for those of you that God has put something there to say, I'm going to bring this over there, you got to listen to that.
All right, we are going to take a little bit of a break here because I need to wrap my head around a few things. And also, I think we might be able to add another guest to this conversation, which is really timely because where we're going next. Thanks so much for joining us so far. Thank you guys, and we will continue in just a moment.